in 2020, I published a book, Votes at 16, which youth enfranchisement and the renewal of American democracy. And so that sort of corresponded, of course, with the pandemic, and it was a sort of a race between those sort of two things. But now that's out, and now I'm trying to sort of spread the word in where I can, because the more that I talk about it and hear from others about it, I get more. I get new insights into what I've already written and better appreciation in some ways. And how this got started actually was I was teaching just an intro to political science class, and I asked the students, as professors sometimes do, just something to get them thinking, and said, why don't we drop the voting age to 16? And then we had a discussion about it, and I played the devil's advocate because they all thought it was a stupid idea, crazy idea, because their 16-year-old brother doesn't know anything, and giving him the vote seems like a pretty insane and certainly counterintuitive idea. And so I gave them a one-page paper to reflect on it and submit it for me the next class period. And everybody in the class, about 20 students, except one, said, no, it's a crazy idea. You know, to be an effective voter, you have to have knowledge, and 16-year-olds don't have the requisite knowledge to make wise decisions as voters. One student, though, actually said that's where she started. But as she reflected on it, she began to think a little bit and had listened to me and what I was saying as the devil's advocate. And then I encouraged her. She got a letter to the editor published in the Asheville, North Carolina paper, which is the biggest, closest newspaper from here. So anyway, and then subsequently, she and I worked on an independent study together. And we sort of pursued this idea a little bit more deeply. And then as we dug into it, we, and certainly I, became more enamored of the idea than I had before. You know, the more I got into it. And I should say that as a political scientist, my specialty is international politics. And so that's what I've studied. That's what I've published on. That's what I've, been my academic life, is to look at how countries interact and peace and war and international cooperation. So American voting laws and rules and everything else was something I had been exposed to in graduate school, but I never really studied. So when I was digging into that material, I found out that American political scientists have studied quite a lot about voting, which is probably not surprising, but there's a lot of literature there. So there was a lot to go through. But when you get into it, some of the traditional arguments against dropping the voting age to 16 seem to just melt away. They don't seem to hold up. And for example, the first thing that I've already mentioned is that young people are 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds who, under my idea, would be able to vote. They don't have as much political knowledge as older people. And, on the surface, that's obviously true, right? That I know more now than I did at 16 and 17. I presume that everybody in this meeting knows more now than when they were 16 and 17. But I also know that some 16 and 17-year-olds know more than people who are 30 and 40 and 50 as it relates to politics. So it's a sort of a spectrum, right? It's a sliding scale. There are people with very low political knowledge, understanding of how American politics is supposed to work and does work. And then there's some people with quite a bit. But the age sort of, for an individual, they're going to go up that way. But but some young people, as I said, are smarter in that way than older people. Are they emotional, are they mature enough? Do they have the emotional maturity to actually handle such things? Well, again, the same thing. I hope that I'm more mature now than I was at 16 and 17, and be able to handle the nuances of voting and all of that. But at the same time, again, some young people, some young people are more mature than older people are. You probably have known and perhaps know 30-year-olds who act very immaturely, and you may see some 16 and 17-year-olds who act very responsibly and have their life sort of together. And so we have this, that in political knowledge, in emotional maturity, or whatever it takes to be a sound voter, there's sort of a sliding scale. It's not just, once you turn 18, you become emotionally mature and politically knowledgeable, right? There's no clear dividing line. The other thing that we know is that we don't test voters for how much political knowledge they have, right? We don't test them for their emotional stability. So once you get to be 18, and you're a citizen, you just go and register to vote, and then you go ahead and vote, right? And you don't have to pass a test or anything else. So so we allow people who don't know how many branches of government there are to vote. We, do lots of things. And the average American voter, and political scientists have studied this, don't really know a lot about how the formal mechanisms of government operate. And so this was the first step in my evolution here was take it a little seriously and see how many of the objections sort of didn't seem to hold up. That we apply one standard to these people that we don't apply to everybody else. Okay, and then the sort of second thing that I learned along this process. The second thing was that throughout American history, the vote and voting rights have been a very contested item of our political system. And it has gone in different directions at different times. At the founding of our country, the founding of our country, in some states, you didn't even have to be a citizen to be able to vote. If you lived in a neighborhood and were a responsible member of the community, people said, well, you should be able to vote, right? In some states like New Jersey, in the early post-colonial period, first period of independence, the women could vote in states like New Jersey. African Americans were able to vote in some of the states. Again, they were property owners and were responsible members of the community. What changes over the 19th century is essentially, for the next century though, is the United States becomes a white man's republic. In order to be a voter and elected political official and stuff, you had to be like me. You had to be a white man for a long time, but not all the way through the decade. You also had to own property. Okay, and then in the 20th century, we see that now the ebb and flow sort of moving in another direction. With the women getting the right to vote. And then the thing that is very important to my project is in the 1971, the United States lowers the voting age to 18. And that is, for me, that's sort of the pivotal period. It's sort of interesting. Somebody mentioned how they're, but anyway, I reflected on this earlier from somebody's comment that those 18-year-olds who first voted as an 18 or 19-year-old in 1972, they're now in the 65 plus age group now. They've worked, that generation has worked their way through the political system. And so first of all, why did they get to vote? Why did they reduce the voting age to 18? And the answer is the Vietnam War. That's one answer. The country was drafting young men, sending them to Southeast Asia, say, kill somebody, and you might be killed. And but they couldn't vote. And the people making the decision to draft them and to send them to Vietnam, were not accountable to those young people who were being sent over there. One of the things that I found was surprising to me is that the first state that dropped the voting age itself to 18 was Georgia in 1943. 1943, again, the draft was happening, and people saw the injustice of drafting people, sending them to Japan or to the Pacific or to Europe to vote, but without giving them the political right to have a voice in the decisions about that. So Georgia led the way, but in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed. And it was the fastest passage of any sort of amendment in the modern sort of era. On the day that Congress adopted it, 5 states ratified it on that very same day. And it was the other states just joined very quickly. Within months, it had been adopted. The vote in the House and the Senate was almost unanimous in both of those. Everybody thought, yes, this is the right thing to do. The other reason that they dropped the voting age to 18 at that time was that the American political system was flying apart. It was crashing around. Every institution was sort of coming down. And part of it was because young people, people of color, but young people, because that's what I'm interested in here, the young people are pushing on the doors. They're occupying administration buildings at universities. They're, demanding free speech in Berkeley. They're doing all of these things. And the system people didn't know at the end of the 1960s whether this whole project was going to last or not. And maybe these young people, if we can get them to work within the system, rather than on the outside, sort of trying to throwing bricks and whatnot at the system, metaphorically. If we can get them inside the system and all that energy and their natural optimism that we can fix things, will sort of redeem our political system. Okay. And so those two arguments were in combination sort of created this 26th Amendment. What happens is that the 26th Amendment and that generation that started to vote then have been dropping the national voting rates down ever since. And it is that generation that is dropping those voting rates down. Okay, so this great idea, and I think it was a great idea. I would have certainly, I wasn't 18 at that time, but I would have supported it. Great idea, but what it's done is that every generation has, since then, every voting group that has entered the electorate has continued to vote at low rates, so that the 65-year-olds and older constantly vote at sometimes up to twice as frequently as young people in the 18 to 24-year-old age group. Sometimes it's only 70% more, but sometimes it's 100% more. And in the midterms elections, it's 2 or 3 times as many old 65 plus old. I can't say old people because that's me now. 65 plus people vote than the 18 to 24-year-old. Okay, and so the explanation for this is, because trust me, political scientists have noticed this for a long time before I got involved in it, and the explanation is that the voting age and voting is a habitual activity. If you start voting, and you vote 3 or 4 times in a row, you're going to be voting the rest of your life, in all likelihood, right? However, if you don't vote the first couple times, 3 or 4 times, it's what political scientists have sort of figured out, 3 or 4 elections, and you don't vote, chances are you never will become a voter, a regular voter. Okay. Now, over the course of an individual's lifetime, an 18-year-old, 24-year-old, when they get to the 40-year-old, they're going to be more likely to vote. So there is a natural life cycle thing. But the 40-year-olds today don't vote as high a rate as they did in the 1960s. Okay. So every voting age is going down, except the 65 plus. They've actually gone up in this period. Better health, I would think. Okay. So the issue is then the habit making. At 18 is the wrong time to try to get people to develop a positive habit, because they're distractions. People are going off to college, joining the military, moving to Chicago. They're doing all these other things. Maybe they're starting their career. Maybe they're falling in love, getting married, and having children. They're doing all these sorts of things. And in that hierarchy of things that they have to do, paying what we call the costs of voting are not anything that finds its way to the top. Better is better. How am I going to pay rent? How am I going to, get a promotion? Or how am I going to get a job? And all sorts of other real life sorts of things that interfere. The cost of voting and the cost in the United States of voting are higher than in most advanced democracies. In many democracies, people are automatically registered to vote when they turn 18. The government knows when you turn 18. They know when, they have this fact, and they just send you, okay, now, when you go to vote, you just say, hey, I turned 18 in February, so I'm legit now, let me vote. But in the United States, we have to go ahead and we have to register. And if we move, we have to re-register. We have to find out where the polling booth is. We have to get to the polling booth. We have to do all sorts of things. But the cost of voting are highest the first time. The second vote is not as expensive. It doesn't cost as much because you're already registered, assuming you haven't moved. So if you're staying at home or in the same apartment or something, you don't have to re-register. You know where the polling booth is. You've been through the exercise of voting. So you know what happens when you go into polling booth. Young people, a lot of young people are just terrified to go into the polling booth to think that they're going to, if you guys ever remember the first time you got on a computer or something and had a document and you're worried you're going to hit the wrong button and it's going to destroy it. Well, that's the way young people feel about voting, right? The first time. Once you go through it successfully, now you're a self-confident voter. So the second time, the costs are not as high. And so then you could more easily pay those costs, okay? But 18, everybody gets the message. Election coming up. Everybody, and the news, TV is full of ads on, get ready to vote and everything. And boy, you just forgot to vote. You forgot to get registered. You didn't do your homework. You haven't done anything. Then the second time, maybe the same thing. At 20 or 21, you're still having lots of real life sorts of convolutions going on. And so all of a sudden now you have 2 elections where you didn't vote. Now you're on the path to not voting. Okay. However, let me before we go to 16, let's just go to this 16-year-old. By dropping the voting age to 16, now just about everybody is still in school. Okay, So just about everybody is still in the public school system, private school system, but the public school system, which means that in a civics course, American government course, or something like that, that just about every state requires, every state, all the 50 states requires something like that for their high school graduates, that they can be shown, here's how you register to vote. Here's when you must register to vote. You must do it by this date. Here's where your polling booth will be. Okay. Here's what you do. You know, have you figured out how you're going to get there? Have you figured out when you're going to get there? Do you know what the difference between Republicans and Democrats are? You know, do you understand what the big referendum is? Do you know what you're going to do if you show up at the polling booth and they say, we don't have your name on the list? Right? So those could be all covered. And what those are the cost of voting, right? And so the public schools are going to pay the cost. And so that first voter is going to, at 16 or 17, maybe even 18, when they eventually come to an election, they're going to cast a vote, right? And they're going to be doing it in the context of, you know, guidance by the school, by the instructor of the American government civics class. Now, if they're successful in this, they've successfully voted, they're more likely to go vote the second time when that time comes around, because again, the costs are lower, they've got that experience, and so they sort of know what to expect. And if they haven't moved or anything, everything is pretty much going to be the same. So they're more likely, now if they voted twice, even if they move, they're more likely then to vote a third time, fourth time. And after that, they're going to be like me, right? You just ring a bell and say there's an election and I'll go down and vote, right? It's not, it's just what, you know, part of like a habit, it's just what you do. The other element here that's a critical element to this is that the high schools at 16 are going to be doing this with students who are poor as well as rich, as non-white as white, as likely to go to college as and also unlikely to go to college. Because one of the big dividing things, we talked about how older people vote more than younger people, more educated people vote more than less educated people. Right? And so going to college, and those who go to college are more likely to be regular habitual voters. My university and a lot of universities, and perhaps every state university, or perhaps even every university that gets federal funding, does a lot to encourage their students to vote. I think there was a law passed a couple decades ago that said that if you're receiving federal funds, you have to put voter registration forms in the mailboxes of your students so you can get them, right? That's not happening to the student who's not going to college. They're not getting anything in their mailbox. They're not getting all of the messages across campuses and things like that that they see. When they go to their workplace, they're working in Walmart or someplace like that, they're not getting that same message, right? But the college kids, right? And that's probably quite a few of us, if not all of us. We're all college kids at some point. But, you know, we got all kinds of encouragement and guidance on how you go about voting. If I ever, you know, as a kid, ever went and voted, and I voted in Chicago for my first time when I was in college, you know, somebody there will know and they'll tell me. If I had not gone to college, I may not have voted for Jimmy Carter in 1976. You know, but I was in an environment, and University of Chicago is not really big on, you know, that kind of public engagement, civic engagement sort of thing as other universities are, right? DePaul, Roosevelt, at least in its old days. But anyway, so you have this the other thing and then I'll just open it up and answer your questions. But there's one more element in here, that when I said that the generation that came of age and voted at 18 for the first time, is they've gone through and they've drawn down the voting rates across the electorate. When we break that age group down by education, guess what? It's not the college kids, it's not the college graduates who aren't voting at the same rates. It's the kids who don't get, or the people who didn't get a high school education, didn't complete their education, or maybe they're high school graduates. There's where the decline has been going, and that's what's been pulling it down. Because yeah, you go to college, chances are you're likely to become a habitual voter. If you don't go to college, you're not as likely to become a habitual voter. You're more likely to be a habitual non-voter. And that's why the importance of dropping it down to 16, where everybody, whether you're going to go to college or not, will get started as a voter. The initial costs will get paid, and then hopefully they'll continue on their own. But anyway, that I'll stop now. I know you thrown a lot of different sort of elements at you guys, but you guys have been very respectful here so far. So let's see if you have any comments for me. I'm taking notes.
I don't know. Okay, perfect. Because Mary, I did see that you wrote something in the chat first. You said you wanted to mention something, so we could go through the chat, and then I saw Bob, you had your hand up too.
So I have so many things I could say. So I could talk all day on this topic, but I won't. First of all, let me just say thank God for Stacey Abrams, who educated a whole lot of people on voting. And this last 4 years, we learned so much more about the vote and voting than probably in my lifetime we ever did. So I think, we have to keep that momentum. And I just read something this morning in the New York Times. It says that 43 states are already mounting challenges to their electoral systems. And so we're going to see a shutdown of these voting opportunities in the next 2 years, I think. Not the next 4 years, but the next 2 years. I was involved with MICVA Challenge here in Chicago for about 13 years. And MICVA Challenge is a youth organization that encourages young people to participate in democracy. And they're high school, for the most part, high school students. And those young people, they really practice democracy as a verb. They really see that democracy is much broader than voting, but that it obviously begins in lots of ways with voting. So young people are, and I want to say this in light of the fact that most of our public schools don't have very vigorous civic engagement programs. You learn what the 3 branches of government are, and you might learn something about the Constitution maybe, or whatever, but it's all so boring and so dead and not alive at all. But these young people really are involved. They work on elections. They go to primary states and participate in Iowa and Pennsylvania and the very critical primary states. They work on campaigns. They work on election day. They have more knowledge of the polling operations than the people who have sat there for years and years and years. And I just think that we have to also push very hard for a very vigorous civics engagement program for young people in high school, because you're right. Once they get out of high school, they're on with their lives. But I think what we've done is a very limited slice of learning about democracy. And, and I think it's very intentional. I'm a very skeptical citizen. I think everything is designed to keep people out of the voting process, which means that we have to work very hard to educate young people at a very young age. this last 4 years, my grandchildren, 12, 14, and 16, they know almost everybody's name, all these elected officials' names. And that's because we were in the midst of this very hotly contested electoral time. And we know what we had for 4 years, but we have to somehow figure out how to involve and not just teach them, but involve them in the electoral process so that they feel that they know what they're doing. I remember when I took my granddaughter to vote for the first time, you are absolutely right. She was terrified. She didn't want to go. I had to force her. I had to drag her. She was scared to death. When we got there, the polling place was crowded. They talked to her real nasty. She said, "Grandma, let's go." And I'm like, "No, you're going to vote." And so we have to figure out all of those things and figure out how to mount our efforts to overcome all of those barriers. But I think MICFA and other organizations, but I think I've really been impressed with the work that MICFA has done, and they have branched out to Detroit, Washington, DC, California. So they have branches around, but their goal is really to educate and engage young people in the voting process.
If you don't mind, I'll just follow up. I'll keep my comments brief, but the role of civics in my project is it's central. What I know about civics around the country sort of conforms to what you just said, Mary, that the way that we teach it and everything and what students get out of it. I think though that if 16-year-olds were being told, that this is going to help prepare you for the election later this semester or the next semester or something like that, that all of a sudden these civics and American government classes might be more interesting. When it's something that is in for a 16-year-old, 18 is sort of like, I don't know if I'm going to get there or not. That's, so far into the future, and so they don't care. If someone says, here's, what it means to be a citizen and you have an obligation or, you have an opportunity and stuff. But, it's years down the road. A lot of 16-year-olds find that irrelevant, right? But if all of a sudden it's attached to, an upcoming election, then maybe I would be interested in learning a little bit about the powers of city government or something like that compared to other levels. So yeah, but it is a central part, and in what I have, because I'm not a scholar of the civics education in the United States. I don't have many solutions for that, but I think that the change, the reform itself would help revitalize a little bit of that.
Yeah, so I raised my hand. I don't know, can I go?
Yeah, I think, well, I couldn't see all the screens at once. I don't know if you raise your hands first or
I don't know. I think I was up for a while now, so.
Okay.
Yeah. So I really think it's interesting. I've been feeling like civics education needs total reform because people don't understand. There's a lot of attention to rights without a lot of attention to responsibilities. And so people then think that government is all bad, but they don't understand what government does or the freedoms that they have and what it takes to maintain them. So I think that along with thinking about reducing the age of voting age, you really have to think about how do we build this understanding of what it means to live in a country like ours and what our individual responsibilities are and collective responsibilities are. I think that besides that, there's interest in the Civilian Conservation Corps, and that's always been one of the best ways for people. And if young people would take advantage of that, working in a different part of the country with people different than them, they might understand that the country's way bigger than their own backyard or where they went to school or whatever. And I feel like that could lead to free college or other ways of incentivizing of working for our country. And it's been done in the past. I think it should be brought back around climate, which I think Biden's looking at. But the other big thing is, while watching the Republicans trying to just control how many people vote, where voting happens, change voting identities, change locations, change timeframes, that we really need House Bill 1 and this new bill, the Voting Rights Act, I think the John Lewis bill, because we're just not going to get to any kind of coherent voting capacity, whatever ages we are, until there's some guarantee that we all can be registered and we have the same privileges, and it isn't state by state, county by county, random party rules by random party rules. So it seems to me many layered. And so my reaction to 16 maybe is interesting. It's really interesting. I never thought about it. But I also think there's other things we need to think about in the bigger picture, because we're watching Republicans just trying to chip away at every way possible to, not allow people to vote, to hamper people's ability to vote, to really take away that privilege. So that's all.
Thank you, Lena. Bob, I know you wanted to, you raised your hand very quickly in the beginning too. I don't know if you still wanted to share.
Yeah, I just have a question. Isn't civics now required by the state of Illinois? Didn't it start this year? I think it is.
I know that I have been in the school systems, and in a lot of the schools that I was in, the kids did not have civics at all.
That was my experience too, but I
Yeah.
talked to some students from Evanston High School, from city schools, and they say now, just like, you have consumer economics and these other requirements that are, come down from the state, and they now have added civics to the list of requirements for graduation. I think it's as of this year.
Well,
Yeah.
Bob, there's civics and then there's civics.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not talking about the quality of the course, but I think a course called civics is now required. I don't know how good it is. I'm just saying something has happened, I believe.
Well,
I would agree with you. I think something has happened in the last couple of years based on sort of my work with MICFA. But I think that you can teach civics and bore the hell out of these young people.
Sure. Yeah.
Kenji.
To your point, Ms. Boria, I kind of wanted to build off of the hypothetical of, introducing civics to kids in high school. I think it's not only important to, introduce these topics, but to get them actively engaged in it. Because say there's no large election coming up for 16-year-olds at the time. If there was a way to, I guess, get them involved in local, state level elections, and I guess other community engagements and community initiatives around their neighborhoods that are involved in politics, that would help to get them engaged more later on down the line when they actually become, eligible voters at the age of 18, or if, the voting age gets lowered.
Also, thank you for the link. I just clicked it right now. It's illinoiscivics.org, and on Friday, August 9, 2019, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed the House bill into law, which requires a semester of civics in grade 6, 7, and 8, employing direct instruction, discussion of current and societal issues, service learning, and simulations of
Yeah, I just want to add that the kids that I know through MICFA, they get involved in all elections, federal and local. And I mentioned in the chat that all the states are getting ready to participate in redistricting. And that's usually sort of a heavily party process, but it would even be interesting to figure out how to get these young people involved in understanding and even doing some hands-on work around redistricting, because Illinois stands to lose 2 seats, 2 legislative seats, and Florida and Texas stand to gain about 5 legislative seats. So, I mean, really kind of understanding kind of the logistics of politics and figuring out ways to have them understand it by being involved with hands-on is so critical. I mean, I just feel like we focus on voting, and voting is so important, but there's so much involved in that process, and there's so much that could be developed for young people to be doing. And so, Kenji, I think your comment was just spot on, you know, that really give young people something to do. They don't want to sit in the classroom and listen to us talk at them. They actually want to do something, and they will be kind of probably better at it than we are, because they are, you know, they have that kind of enthusiasm.
Right. Develop apps.
When I was a teenager, I will never forget, I had my first job at 13 years old, and my supervisors were students from the University of Chicago. And they took us through a political process where we just did all types of work within the community, which really helped me to become a community activist. But just starting at, you know, that age, and I used to go with my father to the barber shop, where they were always talking about politics. So that really gave me a jump in kind of understanding what was going on around me and how important participation was. So starting at a younger age, I think is so important, because it gives you a framework that, one, you have responsibility, you know, to your community, and you also are participating. You become empowered because you're also participating in the process in some type of form. So yeah, having that, you know, opportunity for young people is so important.
You know, I also wanted us to comment on that. So I wrote in the chat a while back that I agree they have to be involved in practice, experience it hands in. And another thing, it's like, I actually currently have 2 kids in 8th grade. I have one, he's in special needs class. The thing, how I see it is it should start at 5th grade, 6th grade, I'm sorry, and build gradually. However, they need to be on the same agenda when it comes to teaching it, because I know here in Chicago, depending on locations of the schools, not everyone is taught the same information. And I feel that if you're going to teach it, it has to be a even playing field all across. And then gradually, little by little, as these children get older, start, you know, getting more involved, and they start building from their knowledge and what they know and actually experience it hands-on.
I just want to jump in real quick, because I think this is an interesting conversation, and I agree with most of what everything says, but I want to just point out something that Cherie shared that made me think about the importance of how we work in community at all levels, right? In my story, I often talk about my father being political and having conversations at home, you know, being part of different organizations, and many other leaders that I hear them, you know, my parents took me to the polls, or I was sitting in this community meeting, and, you know, that kind of, I remember, you know, I remember that, and now I'm a part of this. And so as we think about this work, we have to continue to remember all of these levels, right? That there's a pipeline, and how do we support families? How do we support young people to be engaged? Because, you know, there's many entrances to being civically engaged. And I just wanted to bring that up, because I was just reminded of, like, even my own kids that I used to, you know, youth guidance folks, you all remember my kids used to come to meetings, and, you know, it's just part of who help them be part of who they are is through being part of who I was.
You know, I'm sorry, just to like kind of bounce off of that. The reason I say it, because I grew up in Chicago, but I lived in the suburbs as well. So you see a insight to both sides of the story. When I grew up in a suburb that was a village, and out of 2 high schools from 2 surrounding suburbs, there was 10 Latino kids, and it wasn't really that many Black African Americans in the school. And there was so much I was taught out there that I was not taught in Chicago. And I've actually taken some of I have 5 kids. So I have 2 with special needs, and I have 3 in regular classrooms. And my 8th grader, who goes to regular CPS school, she's in a middle school. And I just asked her, I'm like, what do they teach you? She's like, well, you know, in civics, they teach us about Constitution, but they don't really go into the depth of it. So that's why I feel that if you're going to teach it, it has to be equal, because you have to teach the youth. You can't just teach a few, you know, some things, and then the other one's not. I feel like it's not, you know, they won't just know the same information. So when they go out there, now they have 2 different sides. You just have to go all in. That's how I feel.
I kind of wanted to like add to that point. I really feel like education disparity is like a large part of this conversation, and I think like it's a really significant part of this conversation because like I from like pre-K until before high school, I went to a private school, which is like I didn't even realize how much of a privilege it was until I went to like a public high school. And I just like, as a 9th grader, with all these other 9th graders who had gone to like public schools during their like middle school education, I had already been so far ahead of them. And like my 9th grade education was pretty much really synonymous to my like 7th grade education in private school. So I just feel like even starting from there, like Michelle was saying, like we're not even on an even playing field of like where the 16-year-olds are in what they're learning. So I feel like we need to start with there and make sure that like everyone is getting the same access to resources and education. Otherwise, then we're giving this like voting power to a group of people that don't have access to the education that they need to make good decisions in voting.
If I can say a couple of things here. Something that I found in this whole process that was very interesting. There was a book written just a couple of years ago about running from office. And the scholars did surveys of all these young people and asked them, you know, can you ever imagine running for office? And the responses that they got were way low. Scholars were sort of
Why are your pants
very,
Sorry. Kiss the hello. Can you mute yourself? We can hear. There you go. I got it. I muted them. Sorry, Niall.
yeah, but the you know, hardly any young people could imagine you know, running for office. They didn't think that, and their image. And so these, you know, these are people in their 20s now, probably, maybe 30 by now, because the surveys went over a couple of years. But anyway, you know, what they got exposed to was the, you know, the politics as a zero-sum game, where you have one team against one team, and they're yelling at the other side, and they're decrying the other side. And for these young kids, you know, that's not how you fix society. You're not going to be able to fix society by yelling at each other. And so that's why they just said no. But when they broke the data down and they looked at people, at these young people who had in like an American government course or something like that, their numbers were not real high, but much higher than everybody else's. And the way I interpret that is that that young people see the political system and see its dysfunction, and you know, and so they see how it's not working, and they just don't want anything to do with it. But once they learn about it, the sort of natural youthful optimism says, we're going to make this better, right? They still know the ugly parts of the politics, right? The zero sum aspect of it, you know, my tribe against your tribe kind of thing. But that's okay, you know. Now they want to figure out ways to fix it. And so again, that's why I support this idea of the, you know, certainly endorse the idea of the civics and trying to get students involved and engaged. As I think Mary posted in the chat, one of the great things about Chicago is, for this purpose, is that there's always an election in Chicago. That's what I always remember, some county election, city election, of course, every 2 years, the national elections and stuff. It seemed like you never ran out of elections here. And so there'd be great opportunity, as Kim Ji was suggesting, to get students involved. Now, you know, my book and, you know, everything that I'm about in this sort of project is about voting. And I understand there are many, many other ways of political participation. But you can, you know, my view is you can do all those other things and still be a voter, right? You know, there's, you know, we should want people doing all sorts of things, you know, and getting involved in political process through the non-electoral avenues, but we also want them to be voting, and that's who the politicians will pay attention to that. So, but that was, yeah, one other thing, and then I'll open it. But when political scientists look at those other forms of participation, particularly among young people, college and, you know, kids or young people into their 30s and stuff, again, the more educated they are, the more likely they are to engage in those other forms of politics, you know? So, you know, this bias that we have in our political system, that the more educated you are, the more active you are going to be in politics. It holds not just for voting, but also for these non-voting activities, you know, signing petitions and all that kind of stuff. That you know, that goes on a lot on the internet.
Niall, we had there was a comment earlier from Teresa, and I think this is in response to how the Vietnam War affected the voting age. And so she did bring up that if we lower the voting age to 16, would the government then feel that it's okay to enlist 16-year-olds into the service?
Yeah. Okay, that's actually a very very good point. I saw it when it came up, but I haven't been able to address it. And this is something that only came to me very recently, within the last month. Anyway, a law review article sort of takes up this, not just for military service, but for everything. And the lawyer who was writing this, and I'm not a lawyer, so some of it I'm sure I misinterpreted and everything, but the basic argument is that the age of voting is so central to our sense of identity in the United States, that if we do change that, everything else will many other things will follow, cascade from that. For instance, one of the things that she argued was that you know, there are certain protections for children that are built into legal, you know, things to like foster homes and adoption and things like that, that may, you know, if they were to drop right now, they go to 18. But now if they're dropped to 16, then we're going to be exposing those people to everything else, to greater harm, because laws are there to protect the children. My response to that was, because it doesn't fit my model, right? So I'm going to disconfirm it. But is that I'm not persuaded by slippery slope arguments. You know, I don't think if we drop it to 16 that you're going to see me publish a book in a decade saying we should drop it to 14, right? And 12 and 10 and 8 and 6 and 4, you know. I don't think we have to go there. I think we can draw lines and say, no, 16's too early for the military, right? Because democracies, I did look at this a couple of years ago, actually. Democracies have a variety of ages of majority, so to speak. If you talk about drinking, driving, being able to join the military, take out a loan, you know, those sorts of things, they're all over the place. Voting sort of is 18 is sort of the vote. I mean, the norm, the consensus. But 16, there are 2 European countries that have dropped the voting age to all their elections to 16. Austria did it in 2007. Malta did it in 2018. There are 5 other countries that have voting as for 16 and 17-year-olds. Most of them sort of have compulsory voting. Cuba and Brazil and I should have the list here, but I don't have this. So there are countries, and then there's another 5 countries that I'm aware of that have 16-year-old voting, 18 for national, for the overall voting rights, but 16 for municipal or state level elections. In the United States, there are some cities that have adopted that. So there are cities in Maryland, sort of suburban type cities, so not big urban areas in Maryland, but that have adopted 16 for their elections, not for the federal elections, but for the local elections. Some states in the United States allow the localities to set their, you know, to adjust. Now you can't increase it to 21 or anything, but you can you know, loosen it by dropping it to 16. Some states don't allow that, and I think I'm not even sure. I don't know, have any idea about Illinois. I wasn't able to find the source for that, but I think North Carolina is one where we couldn't do that. Like my county couldn't adopt that. You know, our system, our electoral system, is completely, you know, decentralized, right? It's every state is, you know, 50 different sets of rules that exist, and even more because if different localities, like in Maryland, for instance, there are some places where 16-year-olds can vote, and the next neighborhood over, they can't vote. It's one of our things. The other thing that I was mentioning, because I think somebody brought up the redistricting, one of the things that I discovered along the way was that states don't have any particular interest in getting their more people to vote, right? You know, we get, Illinois, for instance, gets or loses House seats based on population, not on voters, right? You know, Illinois would have the same number of electoral votes if 3 people voted or if 30 million voted, right? It doesn't matter, which means then it's very easy for one of the political parties to sort of say, you know, if we could decrease voting, we might have a better chance to win, you know, because there's no advantage to having many voters. Okay, and we know, and just I'll finish on this, it's been mentioned by others that we are at a time right now of tremendous turmoil about voting rights. I mentioned in my early opening comments that it's always been this way, but sometimes it's more intense. And I think we're in one of these really intense periods. We have the national government, the House of Representatives and the Senate sort of working on a voting rights sort of bill at the national level. But in the states, we see the tide going in the other direction of where voting, it may become more difficult. And so this is an ongoing struggle. It's not necessarily new, but it's something that we need to be aware of, and we need to sort of be involved in it, I think.
I would like to say, reflecting on this discussion, having been involved with youth as well as the politics, mostly outside of the systemic structure all my life, that Mary's position is the strongest. Engaging youth, yes, in education of civics and government, but actively engaging them in participation. Youth don't always care about voting, but they certainly care about what the issues are. They have become the leaders in all of our movements. Very young age, I became involved in the civil rights movement in the late 50s. It was young people who were organizing, taking the initiative, maybe not at age 16, but you know, in the civil rights movement, the lunch counter sit-ins, which, and everything that flowed from that. The all levels of the civil rights movement, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which included not just college students, but much younger, high school students. John Lewis became involved at age 15. Fred Hampton in Chicago, he had been leading a movement for 3 to 4 years when he was killed at age 21, murdered by the city of Chicago. We can look across the spectrum, and the more youth are engaged in practical application of issues that affect their lives, their neighbors, their families, their security, their future, the more they will become interested in voting. I don't think that talking about, for me, youth that I've talked to, they don't, unless they see the connection between voting and the issues, they are not so interested in voting. But the minute they become involved in social justice, equality, equity, education issues for themselves, their friends, their family, their community, the more they have an interest in voting. And so I place much more of an emphasis on the MIGFA challenge and engaging youth actively in every area of education. The more they see the connection between the book and life, the more they learn, the more rapidly they learn, the more excited they learn about education and the whole process of participation. So my emphasis would be on active, a focus on active engagement of youth in the whole civic process, in the issues that affect our lives.
Yeah, I have a question. So speaking about engagement, what do you guys feel like it would look like? Because I know, like, when I volunteer, where I volunteer at the food pantry, once a month, they have a certain age group for the young kids. And you have a certain amount per adult. They could come in and work side by side with the adult and hands in. But when we speak about like the voting, because I know when you go vote and you have everyone that's sitting down right at the tables, what could like the younger generation, younger children, what could they physically do in there? Like without going just only door by door, like to get them more involved.
I know the project that they had where young people could participate in being judges. I thought that was an excellent process to engage young people into the political process. That's just one.
I think you might be referring to the Model United Nations or Model UN. They were in a competition the students are in competition with each other representing different countries. So we could implement something like that at the federal government level and establish a program with the youth where they're representing different states. And they have generally have a main theme, and like for instance, in the Model UN, that's what I have been and was involved with for many years back in California. And I think one of the gentlemen is involved in it right now that was at the last meeting that we had in person at the church. He called in from California and he was involved with the Model UN. But anyway, I think if we did something like that, that really helps to teach the youth how to learn about government and how important it is for them to know how to vote and how to be a representative. And that in that way also we may get more youth that are interested in becoming involved if we had something like that. And it's just a competition that they had, the Model UN had it throughout, actually they had it throughout the country, even internationally, but they had a conference, and they had conferences in the local area, the regional area, national or state and national and international. And they just, you know, learn all about the government. And that I think would be a really, really good way to introduce the youth to our government, our governmental system at large.
I agree. I did notice that Lena and
Yes.
Mariah, you both have your hands up, so I don't know how long ago that was or if it's recently, but
No.
My hand was up before. It's not now.
Yeah, I put mine down and I just put it back up. Well, you know, Niall, I'm just thinking that maybe a case study for the Marjorie Stoneman school is a good one for your proposal, because what happened then, and a lot of lessons were learned from that, from what transpired. One of them was that the students per se, they were underage for voting, but they knew what they were talking about more so than many lawmakers, and they were nonpartisan. They didn't care if they were, you know, Democrats or Republicans. In fact, most of the families of the students were Republicans. So, but they decided to act on their own and do things because they were blamed. Well, they were with right. They were very rightful in saying that you guys have not done what should have been done in 2012 with the situation at the Newtown, you know, in Newtown. And we are going to take charge and do what is right, because this is not a partisan issue. This is a human rights issue. So as they started to, you know, catch attention from the media, the students who were Black and brown said, you know, that they were being, you know, nobody was paying attention to them. Like, for instance, in Chicago. So they themselves made the decision that they were going to give their equity, and they were telling the media, if you don't talk to my friend here who is Black or brown, then we don't want to talk to you, because you need to give them the same kind of attention that you're paying to us. And they did it on their own. And the only thing they had that they were saying, oh, we're going to be soon of age to vote you out. At that moment, had they had the right to vote, can you imagine what would have happened? And they caught the attention of the whole nation. And I think that it would be a great case study for your proposal, because it explains a lot of the things that we're discussing here, that in reality, the kids at age 16, the generational gap is 15 years, right? So these kids are going to start voting at 16. It is their future. We have failed them in many, many ways, not because we wanted to, but it's time for them to start thinking about what is their self-interest, at an early age, because that's going to keep them more engaged. And definitely civics has to be, the issues that pertain to voting, it has to be attached to their issues at home, at a local level.
Yeah, Maria, I do mention the Parkland shooting in my book. I don't really go into a lot of depth, but I do sort of, and I appreciate the dimensions of it that I wasn't aware about, that you mentioned about the white kids getting all the attention and the black and brown kids not, and their response to it. What it reminds me of, though, is that I mentioned that we do have some data on how 16-year-olds vote, and 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, really young people vote. And one thing that, and this is mostly drawn from outside of the United States, but that they tend to be much more inclined towards third-party candidates, things like that. And some people say, well, that shows they're immature, right? If you're in a two-party system like the United States is, third party, you're wasting your vote. But the way I see it, though, is, and I think this goes back to what Maria just pointed out, is that the young people have this sort of imagination. They think outside of the box all the time, almost, they're trying to figure out where the box is in some cases, but they're thinking outside of the box. And so I think the political system, would benefit from an injection more of that in our politics rather than people. When I mentioned I'm a habitual voter, I'm also going to vote Democratic every time, right? I may stray occasionally, but I don't think about it. I don't, when the next election, 2022 comes around, I'm not going to be like, oh, now let me weigh everything, right? We're sort of reflexive. After you become habitually a voter, you know what you're going to do, and that's what you're going to do. Young people, though, they're sort of, no, convince me that I shouldn't support the third party. That's what, that's what excites me, something like that. Whereas it's hard to excite me, You just.
How would they navigate, like, when younger, well, if it were to pass and you have these younger voters going, because I know as an adult, it is intimidating sometimes going to vote and you see all these names, well, in urban cities. And I'm just like, I might know half, and the other half, I'm like, I have no idea who you are. And, and obviously as you get older and you live and you grow up and you start having to deal with certain issues in your communities, and you're like, okay, now I know I need to speak to so-and-so alderman. Now I know I need to get this person out of office. Now I know. How will the youth know that? And more the youth from the city. It's harder. It's very different coming from a small town to a big city and trying, there's just so many people.
Yeah, that's the reality. I'm a political scientist. That's sort of my job. But I vote, down ballot, I like that name. I'm going to vote for that person, and it's random and everything. And somehow our system, sort of, you know, we muddle through. As I said, the American electorate has never been known to be really, you know, finally tuned into the nuances of policy options or anything like that, or even how the political system works. Yet we vote. One of the sayings that I like, I saw online somewhere, was, you know, why don't you let, you know, smart young people vote, right? You let dumb old people vote. Right. And so you know, the idea that that some people think that, you know, we have this, you know, wonderful sort of electorate now, and if we bring in these 16 and 17-year-olds who don't know as much as 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds, you know, I don't, you know, I'm a political scientist, so obviously I didn't know as much as 16 or 17, but we probably all know more now than we did at 16 or 17. But adding 2 more years to an electorate that is not going to change many outcomes. Actually, you know, it's not going to change certainly at the national level. Which brings me to another point that I do want to make, is that the idea of, if there isn't a national election, if it's not the 2-year or 4-year national elections, the local elections and state elections like that, you know, one of the big secrets about voting and the American political system is that you're going to have, your vote is going to be much more likely to be influential at the local level, the smaller, more grassroots. And it's those people who are going to decide whether you're going to get, you know, your streets snow plowed or not, right? You know, you can vote for, you know, Biden or Trump or something like that, but you're not going to influence that outcome. But, you know, you may well, you know, how come that neighborhood gets its streets plowed and mine doesn't, right? You know, and so the, you know, connecting students, I think, to at that level has a lot of virtues, I think.
I think, oh, sorry.
That'd be another way to like engage the children, then taking them out to like your alderman's office and events in the community. Okay, help build that.
I just wanted to like add to that. I feel like field trips and like the concept of field trips and like the hands-on engagement, especially with children, I feel like that is the most like effective way to teach them, because like personally growing up, everything that I remember about like learning about like my community or anything, it all was based on like visiting, like hearing about like the churches that are important in our community wasn't as effective as like going and visiting and like seeing why. So I feel like just the concept of like field trips and like actively engaging with the things that we're talking about, I feel like that could be really important for like children to visualize things as well.
Raquel, you bring up a good point too, especially with what you put in your section. If everybody thinks that people who are teaching the young students, should they be transparent about their own beliefs as well? And I would love to hear what others think about that, especially because I know there's a lot of people in here who work in education currently do. It really resonates with me too, Raquel, because I was in high school, I was trying to get my teachers to have that conversation with me, but they would tell me I can't speak about that in school. Like, I can't be sharing that.
That's definitely where it stems from. Yeah, like just being in a class, because as like a poli-sci student, I have been, and like a senior poli-sci student, I'm pretty sure like I have taken 90% of the poli-sci classes offered at DePaul, and I don't think I could tell you like the actual political beliefs of my DePaul professors. Everything is just what I've gauged personally. And while I don't think that's like a problem, I just feel like there's always just been this like internal like anxiety of like, if I turn in a paper with very liberal beliefs, like, am I gonna get docked down because my professor has like conservative beliefs or just stuff like that? Like, I feel like the transparency should be there, because you should just understand what perspective you're getting taught from, and then you can make your own assumptions. Because if you're just taught as like a I'm a neutral person, but they're not an actual neutral person, then it's just like at odds. I don't know.
Let me jump in really quick because this is something that's really interesting to me because I've had that discussion with some of my political science colleagues. And my position is towards Raquel's position, which is that, you know, I'm a political animal, right? Not just a political scientist, I'm a political animal, right? And I have my sets of beliefs and sort of policy preferences, and my students should be aware of that. Should I grade the ones who differ with me more harshly? No. And, you know, they can judge whether I graded them more harshly because they know what I am. And if they think they got a bad grade because of it, all the conservatives did or something, then I have that kind of trouble. But as Raquel says, is sort of the sort of being deceptive to hide my, you know, my political self behind this objective political science. And so, but some of my colleagues, when I first came to North Carolina, they just the internet. It was 2001, so all of a sudden everybody recognized that you could look online to find out your you know, anybody that you have information on, what their political affiliation is and stuff. And so many of my colleagues switched from whatever they were to independent. Now in North Carolina, you can vote in the primaries as an independent. Some states you can't, right? But so it's you know, you lose out on the primaries, and primaries are increasingly important. But, you know, I kept mine, you know, they can look up mine, and, you know, doesn't bother me. You know, I'm not not ashamed, not afraid to be a Democrat, you know, or a liberal Democrat, or, you know, so, yeah. Anyway, it's an interesting discussion. A lot of my colleagues differ from me on that. So.
Go.
I think too, another thing, we should have like kind of something what they use in the business and the military, like it's like AAR process, which after you do something, you give back feedback, right? There's a certain question, and they just kind of want to know where you're coming from, you know, why you took those actions, why you did what you did, how you came to that outcome. And I think it would help a lot in a lot of these conversations, because obviously, you know, one thing we're taught, it's like, you don't know where that person's coming from, their background, what makes them, you know, I know in certain communities, because of where you're located, like my grandpa's from a town outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, and he's Black, I'm mixed. And it's like, my grandmother came from Mexico, and it's like, she was a very white, like pale Mexican lady. She passed away. But I mean, I think those are conversations, once again, that need to be held just to kind of get that background information, you know, because I've noticed that a lot of people, like I have aunts in Texas, down in Laredo, and, you know, who they voted for, like, we have a family chat group, and like just the clashes we have in general versus, because, you know, we live here in Chicago, we see one thing, but once you step out, like we're always saying, once you step out of that setting, it's totally different. And I think, yeah, people just need to, like going back to Raquel and like I was mentioning too, the transparency, they need to be okay with teaching that and let people know it is okay to be different, to think different, but you know, that's another major thing. I think that going back to the 16-year-olds, they need to be taught that as well.
It's one of the reasons I think a civilian conservation corps is really possible, because you need to really live in another part of the country or meet people from different parts of the country, different contexts. Otherwise, you just are stuck in your own little bubble, as we all are. But it just builds a better understanding that there's other ways that people think and live and approach life, and it makes for less fear, I think, and therefore othering. You know, so.
Yeah, I agree with you, Lena, and then also Michelle. I just wanted to add, you know, the naturalization part of this. You know, I'm a naturalized citizen, and I posed a question in the chat, but and I appreciate Maria answering my question, which I figured it was that way. But as naturalized citizens, right? How how do we involve naturalized citizens in the question, right? And then, how do we see this also from that standpoint of immigration, right? When the kids come, from other countries, knowing different ways of governments, which are, really, really muddy, and really democracy in other parts of the world doesn't mean anything.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you, Monica, for bringing that to light. And really, I do want to respect a lot of people's times. We are getting to the 2 p.m. For those who want to continue staying, I know we could be here all day for sure. But does anyone have any comments or opinions that they'd like to finish with? This is the time. Maybe somebody who says, Niall, I disagree with you, or I'm not sure, but.
I just want to say, if you have not looked at the documentary City So Real, you should really check that out. There's so much that can be taught through that documentary. It really shows you Chicago and how, how segregated we are in our thoughts and opinions when it comes down, to voting and our knowledge. It blew me away, and you can see it on Hulu now, and they actually added another episode that included COVID-19. And it is so powerful, and it really, it's like you almost should give a medal for anybody who can get on the ballot, because that process in itself needs some reform. Yeah. And I had a colleague that was involved, and they literally had to spend the night at a hotel to keep all their signatures safe before they turned them in. So I'm just want to tease you with that, but I'm just going to say, take a look at that piece, a teaching tool all on its own.
I just want to raise one point that I think we kind of didn't address. One of the young persons on the chat mentioned young people who are kind of marginalized and who are kind of out of anybody's formalized system. And I think we have to keep in mind that this is a larger and larger part of our electorate. And how do we engage young people who are not connected to any of these formal systems? I think that's a real important point to keep in mind.
Yeah. Thank you. And so, Niall, is there anything you'd like to close it off with?
Well, I'm just going to say that this was a very enjoyable 2 hours for me. This was a lot of fun because the context, the greater context that came out in these sort of discussions is very helpful for me, because whenever you study something real intently and everything, that's what your universe becomes, right? And I confess to you that right now, voting and everything that's what my focus is. And it's voting for 16-year-olds and stuff. And it's the ones in school, not the dropouts, right? And it's not these other forms of, but I do think it's, it is part of a puzzle, and I think it's a puzzle that I get the sense that everybody who is at this meeting here, is trying to put together and trying to work on, and to make it to make our politics a better place, and a better system. And there's multitude of challenges, but that's life, right? That's a lot of struggles in life. You get some accomplishments though, and so you can be proud of it and working together. One last thing though, because it was brought up, the Model UN, I threw it in the chat. What I like about Model UN in particular is that, it's sort of a competitive sort of thing, but it's a competition between who can get things accomplished, right? And you get things accomplished in there by working together, not by getting more votes than the other side, or, not being the most eloquent speaker. It's, so it's a positive sum, competition. And I think that's the kind of thing that we as a country need to get beyond. That it's not, politics isn't zero sum. If we, figure out new and novel ways to work together, we can get a positive sum. We can all be better off.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Niall. And again, it's been a pleasure to have you here. And I want to thank Maria for introducing us so you could be here today. And
yes.
I learned a lot. So thank you everybody else for joining today too as well. I hope you enjoy the rest of your 50-degree summer Chicago.
Real quick,
also,
Kevin.
yes,
Real
of
quick.
course.
I know Niall has a book, right? I mean, is that, and you can get it on Amazon? Is it something that we can afford to buy, or how?
Well, I can't answer that. Is it a great value? Yes, it is.
All right. I'm just
so it is pricey. At some point, I assume they'll drop it. I'm not somebody who reads and buys or even reads electronic versions, but the electronic version is cheaper, but
right.
ebook. But I can't read books like that. But anyway.
Can you repeat the title again?
It's Votes at 16, Youth Enfranchisement and the Renewal of American Democracy.